I've been seeing a lot of buzz around the internet for the announcement of Ableton Live 12. It's currently in beta right now at the time of recording this video. I've seen a lot of videos where people sort of shotgun through all of the different features that are going to be coming in Live 12, and that's great. It's good to know the new stuff that's coming down the pike. What I decided to do for Sonic Academy, though, is just really go a little deeper on a few of the new features that are really resonating with me, things that I really enjoy using, and I've been having a lot of fun with. Now, in this particular video, I want to focus on the brand new synth called Meld, which is a very interesting approach to sound design. Now, when I first picked up Meld, I was a little critical of it. I wasn't super happy because there's not a lot of control. However, the more I started playing around with it, the more I realized it kind of goes with Ableton's ethos of just working quickly and getting cool sounds using minimal controls. It's this sort of macro-based approach to synthesis, which is pretty interesting. It's a little bit different. So we'll dive a little bit into that. I'll kind of give you a brief overview of what it is, what it's all about, and then we'll actually do some practical sound design. We'll make a couple of different sounds for a little track idea I've got started here. So let's jump right in and get excited about Ableton Live 12. So I've got a simple session set up here, and I want to just kind of go over what's going on in the new Meld synthesizer. And it's worth mentioning, I am still using the Live 12 beta at the time of this recording, so some things may be subject to change. I don't imagine they'll change anything too drastically in this synthesizer, but let's just kind of go over what's going on here. I remember when I first got my hands on Meld, I was a little disappointed because the controls are fairly limited, and the sound design geek in me really wanted to be able to get in there and just tweak everything. But the more I started using it, the more I came to realize it's very much goes along with Ableton's ethos of just get going quickly and make decent sounds without too much hassle, without too much thinking, really, more with experimentation. So what we have here are two sound generators. You can kind of think of these like your oscillators, but they're a little bit more than oscillators. Each different sound generator represents all these different kind of modalities of synthesis. So you'll have some like basic shapes, for example. This is going to be kind of your subtractive waveforms, and you can kind of scan through them in a similar way you might with a wavetable. Some of these are going to be somewhat similar to wavetables, but others are not. Other ones, for example, like the harmonic FM is going to give you a little mini FM engine with one carrier and one modulator. We have things like Crackle, which is actually playing, I'll play a little bit here. It's playing like samples of like vinyl crackle and stuff like that. So there's a lot of different, like I said, modalities of sound design, of synthesis going on here. So no two sound engines are unique. It's a little bit similar to Arturia's Pigments, if you've used that, where you have different engines. They call them engines, right? Where you have like the sample-based engine, the subtractive engine, or the analog engine, they call it. The wavetable engine, the harmonic engine. This gives you a lot more, but it's a little bit more limited. So each engine only gives you two controls. It's kind of like this macro-based sound design. So these two dials are going to change based on whatever engine you choose here. So Basic Shapes, for example, is going to scan between the different waveforms in a wavetable type fashion. Tone is going to do something slightly different depending on the waveform that we've chosen. Let's just throw an oscilloscope in here quickly so we can kind of see that. If I can find in my million Max for Live devices, here we go. So here we have a sine wave, right? Let's maybe zoom in on that a little bit. And if we start to change the shape, obviously we're changing to a triangle wave, we got a sawtooth wave, a square wave. So if we're in the sine wave, for example, we get this kind of wave folding effect, almost similar to an FM sound that it gives us. Whereas if we have the square wave, it's going to give us more of a traditional pulse width modulation sort of thing going on here. So like I said, each different engine is going to have slightly different parameters. So it's all about picking a sound engine and then using these macros to get your starting tone. And then everything else from here is pretty familiar if you've used any synthesizers before. So we have an amp envelope here. We have a modulation envelope that can be assigned in the very robust modulation matrix. By the way, let me close my browser. We can click this button here and expand the modulation matrix to see every modulatable target in the synth, and then all the different modulation sources up here. Now we have two separate engines, and each one is on its own independent signal path. So it has its own engine, it has its own modulation parameters, or modulation sources, I should say, the envelopes, the LFOs. And it also has its own individual filter. Now that is one little gripe I have with this synthesizer right now, is that the two engines are completely isolated. There's not a way to like combine them together and then run them through the filters in series mode or anything like that. It's just two parallel engines that are always parallel. We can't change that. There's also not an additional filter that we can sum them together in, which would have been nice. But anyway, yeah, we've got our modulation here. We can toggle between the modulation sources for engine A and engine B here. We've got some global settings, things we can do like turn on and off oscillator key tracking for the engine if you just want an engine to sort of drone at a constant pitch instead of following your keyboard. You can also switch between a portamento mode and a glissando mode, which will kind of step between different pitches. But moving over here to the right, we have our two filters for engine A and engine B. We got a lot of different filter types here. You got your standard state variable filters that'll change between a low, a band, a high pass, and a notch. We've got our filter frequency or resonance, or the resonance is over here labeled as Q. And then there's several different filters. Some notable ones, I'll kind of play around with some of these, are the filter, which is kind of like a distorted filter. It's got this drive control, and you can kind of drive the oscillators, the sound engines through it to get a little more distortion out of it. And then you've got these really interesting resonator filters. You'll see the little scale awareness button, or not button, this little scale awareness icon on those, just to indicate that if we have the scale awareness function on, that we can have those tuned to the scale that we are playing our set in. So these are pretty cool. Plate resonator and membrane resonator. These are very similar to collisions resonators. They give a similar tonal effect. I'm not sure exactly how they're doing it, but they're using the filters to emulate the plate resonator and the membrane resonator. And there's all kinds of cool stuff you can do with the frequency where you can tune it. So we'll maybe play around with that. And then over here to the right, we have a mix section where we can adjust the volume levels of each engine, the panning positions. There's also this interesting tone control, which is kind of like an output EQ. So for example, let's just fire up engine A here. We'll change it to a square wave. And let's adjust our filter. So we just have a standard low pass filter here. It's a little bit loud. Let's turn that down. That's from me playing around with the volume. I apologize for that. So we've got this tone control, and what this does is if we turn it to the left, it's kind of like a low shelf, high shelf EQ, where it's like I'm boosting the lows and dipping the highs. Whereas if I turn it to the right, it's as if I'm shelving up the highs and dipping down, or cutting down, not cutting, but pushing the lows down, attenuating the lows. So that's a nice kind of final tonal adjustment there, but again, it would be nice to have like a final filter that everything is summed through at the end here. Unfortunately, we don't have that. And then on the far right side here, we have some global controls for polyphony. We can switch between mono, turn a legato function on and off. If we're in polyphonic mode, we can go up to 12 voices of polyphony here. We've got this spread control, which is kind of like a unison detune that works with the stack here. Stack is going to give us either 2 or 3 copies of both sounds summed together. So basically the entire sound that you're generating will get doubled or tripled, and then you can use spread to kind of add some unison detuning effects. One interesting thing about the spread is that it actually shows up as a modulation source in the matrix. So you can see here, the default meld patch has the oscillator detune amount, or the engine detune amount, and the engine pan amount already mapped. And you can adjust the intensity of that if you want to. This is nice, for example, if maybe you're making a bass sound and you want to detune it, but you don't want to spread it out. So you can just turn this pan function off here, double click it, set it to 0. And then the spread control is really only affecting the detuning of your oscillator engine. So that's kind of a nice little feature. Let's reset that to how it was. And then finally, we have an output drive, just kind of distorting the output. There's also an output limiter in case things start to get a little bit too loud. And we also have our output volume here on the bottom right-hand corner. So pretty straightforward in terms of the layout here. And like I said, I think the Ableton's methodology behind this was, let's just make synthesis approachable and quick and easy. Let's let people have only a couple of knobs to tweak these different engines and make some interesting sounds. So that being said, let's try to make a couple sounds here. I got this basic session here. I got kind of like a drum and bass loop, and I've got, that actually sounds kind of cool, just that square wave. But I have this bass line here. Let's solo it, and let's actually reinitialize Meld. And we'll just make a bass sound out of it. Let's use one of the different engines here. So let me close out of my hot swap mode. We'll get out of the browser. Let's try making a nice little FM bass sound. So let's go to harmonic FM. And if I start to turn the amount up, we'll start to hear more frequency modulation. Now my ratio is set to 0, so it's just giving me like a really wonky, almost like super, super low pitched pitch modulation. But let's start to turn the ratio up. This is going to give us a higher tuning of our modulator waveform. And then if we start to turn the amount up, we'll get a little bit more of a traditional FM type sound. Now, I'm not sure exactly the number values on the ratio, if, you know, what's 2 to 1, what's 3 to 1, what's 4 to 1, what's 1 to 1. So you just got to kind of play around with it. But I was finding if I had it around 70, I had a nice even tuning there. So what I'm going to do is I want to modulate this amount control. So let's open up our modulation matrix. Let's go to the envelopes, and I want to use the modulation envelope here to modulate the amount. So what I need to do is find the mod envelope here on the top, M envelope. And then if I click on the amount, it'll actually highlight it on the target list for me. So we see oscillator 1, macro 1 is what this is called, or oscillator macro 1. So these two dials, again, they're called macros across all the oscillators, but they will change function depending on the engine that we choose. So I want to modulate this amount. That's going to be macro 1. So let's go to our mod envelope, oscillator macro 1. Let's start to turn that up a little bit. We start to get a little bit of that classic FM style bass. Now we can go to our envelope, maybe make the decay a little bit shorter, maybe bring the modulation amount down a little bit, maybe like 25%. We could start the amount a little higher. Let's hear how it sounds with our drum and bass loop. I'm going to close the mod matrix right now. And now that I'm hearing it in context, let's go back to the matrix. Let's just reduce the modulation amount a little bit more. Just want to get a nice subtle FM bass here. Now, one thing I'm noticing about this is when we're adding the FM, I'm losing a bit of the sub. Oh, also, I am hearing the engine B. Let's actually turn that off. We're just going to focus on the harmonic FM. Now, I'm not hearing as much of the bottom end of this because we're adding all these upper tones with the FM, with the frequency modulation. So one cool thing we could do is we could actually change the filter here. Let's change it to this EQ peak. And what that's going to allow me to do is just boost a certain frequency. So it's kind of like just pulling up a peak on an EQ and you pick the frequency you want to boost. Now, what I want this to do is I want it to actually follow the pitches that I'm playing on the keyboard. So I'm going to take the cutoff. I'm going to actually bring it all the way down to 20 hertz. Now, I don't necessarily want to just boost 20 hertz, but what I can do is I can go to my mod matrix. Let's open it back up. And what I can do is I can find under the MIDI and MPE modulation sources pitch. And if we find the filter frequency as the target and we take the pitch and we turn it all the way up to 100%, basically what's happening is this filter frequency or this filter cutoff is now fully tracking the pitch of my keyboard. So any notes I play, the fundamental frequency is going to get boosted by this amount here. So it just pushes the low end up a little bit on this sound. It's kind of A/B that if the filter's off. We hear a lot more of the top end. And then this just pushes the lows out a little bit more. I kind of like that. Keeping the Q or the resonance all the way down, that's going to keep it nice and wide. So it's not just focusing on a single frequency and boosting just that. It's kind of boosting the lower range of frequencies in my sound. We could do a similar thing with this tone control, but this is just sort of a static control and it won't change based on where my pitch is on the keyboard. So kind of like the sound of that. Let's hear that in context again with the drums. It's a nice little simple bass sound. To get started, we'll change it to monophonic mode, and maybe we'll stack it. Maybe we'll add a little unison. I'll start to turn the spread up. Now again, I don't want it to really spread out in the stereo field, so let's find the spread in the modulation matrix here. Let's turn the pan position all the way to 0, and then the detune is up already. So all we're getting is a detune effect from the spread here. Let's check that soloed again. Yeah, so some nice subtle detuning on that. Let's turn the volume up here. We've got a lot of headroom. We'll just bring this up to 0 decibels. And that sounds good. So we got a nice decent bass. Now let's go over here. I got this Pluck synth. Just, again, an initialized version of Meld here. And it's just playing a sine wave. Let's stick with one engine again for this, just so we can really hear what the engine is doing. And I want to change this to, let's try these noisy shapes. These are kind of cool because it's going to give us all the basic shapes, but we have this rough control, which adds like a little bit of noise modulation to the sound. It just like grits it up a little bit. Bring that rough down a little bit. Interesting. Okay, so let's work with that. And then what I want to do is let's go over to the filter. I want to use one of those resonator filters to make this almost like a bell type sound. So let's use the plate resonator filter. Now we don't hear anything yet because it's tuned all the way up at 20.5 kilohertz. But if we start to turn that down, we hear this resonating effect. Let's turn the Q up. That's going to give us more of a prominent resonance. It's starting to sound a little bit like physical modeling, like Collision, if you've ever used Collision before. Or you could check out my tutorial on Sonic Academy. I went all over Collision, top to bottom. So the ratio and the Q controls here are going to kind of control the timbre of that plate resonator, basically what it sounds like. This is going to allow us to tune it. Now I want it to actually tune to the key of my song, so I'm going to use this scale awareness button here. Now that means that when I move the frequency control here, it's going to move to specific pitches within the scale, so it'll tune nicely to what's going on with my bass and any other music I might have playing in my track. So let's just set this somewhere around 349. Turn the volume up a little bit, just the track volume here, so we can hear it. We'll adjust that as needed. So that's sounding pretty cool. Let's maybe add a little modulation to this. So if let me solo this really quick, and you can hear, if I move this Q, changes the timbre of the sound quite a bit. Now the volume does get loud, so let's turn that output limiter on. Let's maybe set it somewhere around 40. So we get a little bit of that resonance, but not too much. And then let's modulate this with an LFO. So if we go to the LFOs, we have basically two LFOs, but we have this bonus LFO1 FX, which is going to essentially take the settings in LFO1, but apply different effects to them to like ramp it up, or you can quantize it and do these weird kind of stepped patterns and things like that. So let's try applying the LFO1 effects to the plate resonator Q setting here. So again, we're going to go to our matrix. I'm going to click on the Q. Now this slider here is called Filter Macro 1, and let's use LFO1 effects to modulate that. You can start to hear that moving up and down, hopefully. Hear that tonal change. Now I'm only playing one note at a time. I have this arpeggiated pattern, so let's maybe change it to mono mode. Now I'm noticing when I change it though, it's kind of cutting out the resonance of each previous note. So maybe we'll leave it on poly mode, but I'll just reduce the voices here, maybe to like 3 or something like that. So we get a little bit of that resonance, but it doesn't ring out for too long on each note. Okay, anyway, let's use LFO1 effects, and it's modulating that Q control. Let me click on LFO1 effects, and let's play around with some of these. Let's maybe do, well, we got fade in here. But I'm playing short notes, so fade in, that's probably not going to do too much for me. Let's try this sample and hold, which will give us some random values here. Just set it to a value of like 50%. Let's try slew down. Interesting. So we're kind of redrawing what's going on here in this LFO. Let's turn the LFO retrigger off, and let's maybe slow the rate down a little bit. I like the fact that it's not synced. It's in Hertz mode. It's just going in cycles per second here. So you got this slow sine wave as the basis, but then LFO1 effects is kind of turning it into this weird, jagged, almost sawtooth pulse wave hybrid thing. So we're getting this constant movement. Might be cool also. Let's maybe modulate this rough parameter as well. So we'll go to the matrix again. That's going to be oscillator macro 2, right? Yeah, so we'll use LFO1 effects. Let's maybe go positive on this as well, give it a little modulation amount. So we just get this constant change to the tone. Let's go to the volume envelope. Let's maybe make it a little bit more of a pluck sound. So I'll bring the sustain down, bring the decay down, maybe give it a little release. Give it a little attack just to prevent any clicks. And let's maybe add a little spread. We'll do some unison. Give it a little more decay. That's nice. Let's hear that with our bass and our drums. Push this spread a little bit more. Maybe drive the output. Ooh, that gives it a nice kind of buzzy upper harmonic when it starts to limit. Add some nice randomness to it. I bet if we put this through some delay, I have some delay on my return track here. That's really cool. Nice. I might just tame the volume a little bit here. Let's turn it down. We could turn our engine volume down a little bit too. And maybe just to tame some of the high end, we'll bring the tone control down. because we do get some bright highs popping in there. Cool, and then last but not least, I have a pad sound over here, and just because I don't want this video to be 30 minutes long, I actually already created a pad sound, and I'm using this engine called Swarm Square. Now you have these swarm versions of all the basic shapes, which is kind of like a super saw or a super square or a super triangle, super sine on steroids in a weird way. So let me just kind of walk you through what I did here. I used a MIDI chord effect. Well, I actually didn't use it. I built it into this rack that I made, but it's not being used, so I'm just gonna minimize that and get that out of the way. But I'm using the Swarm Square. Let's solo this, and I'm just gonna play. I have this nice pad, just playing kind of a minor 9 chord here. So we've got a square wave as the basis. Motion is gonna give us more of like a, kind of more of a strong detuning effect. Spacing, which I've assigned to a macro here, I'm not sure exactly what it does, but it does a really nice thing where it kind of like spaces the detuned voices out in a way where it sounds harmonically very different. I found a nice range here. If I go from 0 to like 29.7, that just sounded really nice to me. So that's something I'll probably automate when I write this track. You can see over here in my envelopes, I just have the amp envelope. I've increased the attack a little bit to get a little bit more of a slow pad attack and a nice long release. Polyphony's at 8. We've got the spread all the way up at 100%. Stack is at 3, full 3 voices here. I'm only using Engine A. But another interesting thing I'm doing here is I'm using this vowel filter, which is kind of like a formant filter. And I've got a couple macros. You can see I've mapped all 3 of these parameters to macros. So I got the formant frequency here. Oh, the other thing I did is I put an auto filter after this to just kind of be my global summed filter that I was complaining about earlier. But let's actually open that up and just, that'll essentially bypass that so we can hear the full sound now. And let's take a listen to that oscillator timbre. You can hear how that really changes it. And then as we move these formant filter controls, here's the frequency. This nice kind of talky filter effect, really, really cool. The resonance is gonna emphasize that more as we sweep the frequency. And then the filter morph control here is gonna kind of change the vowel that we're hearing. So I figured those 3 parameters could be really fun to mess around with. And we're able to do that. The vowel filter works really well with these swarm oscillators because we just have a really nice, thick, detuned sound with lots and lots of harmonics to work with. I can't remember what I did for modulation here. I think all I did was, I used LFO1 to move the filter macro 2, which is this morph control, just to get some constant, subtle, sort of like bent triangle wave modulation. So you can hear, I'm not touching anything, but we hear this subtle motion in the sound. And you can kind of see the LFO tracking here, sort of moving up and down, and that's moving this morph parameter. So it's changing the vowel that we're hearing, essentially. So this is a fun sound that I made. And just wanted to show off some of the capabilities here of Meld. So again, this is a pretty cool synthesizer. You know, I don't know if it's gonna be anyone's new like desert island synthesizer, but there's definitely some very unique things here in terms of the engines and the types of tones that you can generate before you start modulating and filtering and doing all your more traditional synthesis stuff. It is nice that they've limited the controls. Like I said, I was kind of complaining about that at first, but I kind of like that it's limited because it forces you to just pick an engine, mess with the macros, and just get going making sounds quickly. Even if you're not super, super well versed in synthesis, you can still get some pretty cool sounds out of this thing. So hope you enjoyed this, and when Live 12 does finally drop, I hope you have fun with Meld, making a lot of cool sounds. I'll catch up with you guys soon on another Sonic Academy tutorial. Take care, everyone.